Seminar series. I'm thrilled to be here. I've heard a lot about your group and all the amazing work that you've been doing. And now with Dr. Glamour here, I think we're going to do more exciting work. And I'm looking forward to seeing all the progress. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about some of the work that we've been doing in our lab over the past 5-6 years or so. Um, and I think, as the title says, there are a lot of terms here which I think sort of really speak to the multidisciplinary nature of our work, where we are trying to build these sophisticated AI-based frameworks to look at mainly dementia and different forms of dementia. And for unlike most presentations, what I usually do is I try to first actually talk about my team. So this is actually a very special slide for me. I don't want to put this in the acknowledgements. I want to put this at the front because this is also relates to why the work we do is truly multidisciplinary, because we have, I'm very proud to have a team of trainees who are mainly coming from, BU, but also from multiple different departments. As you can see here, some of them are PhD students in computer science, whose goal is to just basically think about algorithmic aspects of it because they want to get a PhD in CS. But then we also have some PhD students in neuroscience and some from electrical and computer engineering. I'm also very happy to work with all the MD students in the medical school. And together, what we do is we sit in a room and then work with each other, and the magic happens because of the interdisciplinary collaboration. I'm also very thrilled to collaborate with multiple different clinicians across the medical campus, as well as some external collaborators. As you can see, there are like neurologists and different kinds of specialists, radiologists, neuropsychologists, neuropathologists, etc. They teach us a lot in terms of how to really think about the clinical question. And together, I think we are trying to make a difference in terms of creating these models, which hopefully will have clinical significance one day. And we are making good progress, and we are thrilled to sort of share some of the progress today. I also want to sort of really give a high-level overview of how we are thinking about these problems, right? So ultimately, the first thing we do is, we approach these clinicians or clinical researchers, and then we sort of really think about what are those clinical questions, right? So AI is there everywhere, and everybody's thinking about AI in different form or shape. But for us, I think we want to start off with a clinical problem. So, and that is really the first step. And when we sort of really look at all those real world scenarios on how AI has been implemented, especially in a neurology setting, I think the main question that we are trying to address is, how can an AI system be developed that can address this question related to differential diagnosis of dementia? Clearly, if a patient walks into a clinic, the goal of the neurologist is not to make a binary classification, but to really see through the entire data that they can collect in a visit, and then process all that information using their expertise to sort of make this differential diagnosis. I think that's kind of really the key step. And the problem is a lot more complicated than making a simple classification. So that is something that we have learned by speaking with many, many clinicians. And that's how we start. And then once we sort of really think about the question, then we really ask these other questions related to, is there really a need? Why do we need to actually even build such tools, right? Because, if someone says that, oh, if I can just do a simple mini mental state exam, I can tell if somebody can have dementia or some kind of cognitive impairment. Why do I actually need to build these tools, right? So that's the sort of the second layer of the question that we really think about. And then ultimately, we don't want to simply apply some cookie cutter approaches to really solve the problem. We really want to think about, is there a need to actually build these sophisticated frameworks, algorithmic advancements, so that these questions and the need that we are trying to address can be actually resolved? And ultimately, which I have learned only recently, is that by doing all these things, we can make progress in science, but at the end of the day, is anybody going to pay for this? When I say pay for it, I don't mean necessarily a company paying for it or a hospital paying for it, even a grant paying for this, right? So these are some of the things that we think about. And we are approaching this in a very practical sense because, at the end of the day, if I have to manage a lab of 10 people, I have to figure out a way to sort of continue making progress. So these are some of the things that we think. But clearly, we are motivated by the clinical question. And I don't think this slide is new to this audience here. I think everybody knows the problem. I think dementia is a global concern. Cases are always rising. But the other thing which I really found interesting was that I was reading a paper from 2018 in Lancet Neurology, which I think provided a sobering statistic, which I think caught my attention. And it was saying that about, the supply of US neurologists, we are in shortage. And literally in the last 5 years or so, I have seen in front of my own eyes, some of the neurologists got burned out at BMC and they actually left the profession. And some of them joined pharma companies, some of them actually left neurology for good. So there is a critical problem here. On one side, we have this specialist neurologists who really want to not spend enough time in neurology, seeing patients. And if I even go to the medical school, the class of 150 or 180 people who enter every year, not many people really want to be neurologists. There might be something going on here. And the third thing is that I've noticed that obviously the number of people who might have these neurodegenerative conditions is actually on the rise. So we are actually facing some kind of a reality check here where I think the problem is only escalating. So for that reason, I think we've been really focused on thinking about how do we build AI-driven tools that can truly be assistive in a neurology setting. And for that to happen, obviously there are so many things we have to do, but at least that has been our mission statement to really think about how to build a tool that a neurologist would trust to be truly assistive in a clinical setting. And for that, we've been really trying to think about the approaches, the methodologies, the data collection, and obviously working with all the experts to sort of validate these models, right? So the steps that I've outlined here is to first of all think about how to harness multimodal clinical data in native formats and build frameworks that can process all those things automatically. And the second thing is to really think about what is that multimodal data? How do you actually capture the information truly in a sense that the neurologist actually is capturing in a clinical setting by combining information such as clinical demographic data, history, medications, bedside cognitive tests, neuropsychological tests, functional activities, neuroimaging, EEG recordings, and so on. And then once we build these frameworks, we focus very deeply on thinking about validating these methods. First, we start off with computational validation, which means we basically train the models on certain cohorts and we try to truly test the performance of these models on external cohorts, which we have not used for training. We also brought a lot of clinicians and the collaborators that I've outlined before to do this kind of a head-to-head validation on how the model compares with the experts. And then finally, we also have data from postmortem evidence, which we use to sort of validate the model predictions. And there is another practical reason why we also want to do it. People who are into the clinical trial world may appreciate this slide, where the cost it takes to successfully perform a dementia trial or an Alzheimer's trial is very, very high. And for those who are familiar with the terminology, I just want to spend a little bit of time to talk about it. So effectively, if a sponsor or a pharma company wants to do a trial at a site, one of the things they do is they say, I need 100 patients from this site, and I want to get these patients who are meeting this inclusion exclusion criteria. And it turns out, at least in the context of dementia, the clinical diagnostic criteria does not necessarily meet the clinical trial inclusion exclusion criteria. So there is a bit of a gap between that. And the reason is because normally in a clinical setting, things such as PET scans are not done because they're not reimbursed. There are some other things like CSF draw is not done often. But at the same time, the diagnosis is made based on symptoms, based on other things that the neurologist can administer on the patient. But as it turns out, for most of these trials, you will need a PET scan. You need to make sure that the scan is actually positive on, let's say, amyloid or tau. So there is that gap. And when the sponsor actually enrolls these patients, they spend lots of money to make sure all these individuals get these scans. And it turns out that the screen failure rate for dementia and especially Alzheimer's trials is almost like 80%, which means, only 20 of those 100 people who actually get enrolled in the trial actually turn out to be screen positive. So that's a huge burden on the system. And probably a big factor why most of these trials are not necessarily successful per se. So here, I think we can make a difference as well. And some more statistics is that, at the end of the day, when you really account for all the costs for a successful trial, we are talking about billions of dollars spent on making sure that this trial is done in the right way so that you can get the right patients that are screened for PET positivity. So these are few other motivations as well. Like I said, there is that clinical motivation, but there is also this clinical trial motivation that we are really thinking about carefully and really asking that question, where can actually AI truly help? And this has been, I think, one other example where we found AI could be useful potentially, and we are building tools to address that. So from the research standpoint, I think what we have been thinking also very carefully is, given that we have all these different frameworks and all these different modalities of data that come in to building these AI systems, can you actually make these models very interpretable? Which means, when the model is making a prediction, can the model also explain why it's actually making that prediction? Similarly, can you somehow process all this data, make sure that in reality, for example, let's say if I'm training a model on 10,000 cases, and if I'm collecting, let's say, patient history, MRIs, and neuropsych tests on all these 10,000 patients, but in reality, if I want to really deploy this tool in a setting, maybe not every patient would have a neuropsych test done. And at the same time, if you're expecting that every model that is trained to have all the input data, then it's actually very tricky to make it really useful in real world. So we are trying to build these resilient systems which are flexible enough that when you're training the model, it is training on whatever forms of data or whatever modalities of data that is available, and also be ready in a clinical setting or any other real world setting where if one modality data is missing, the model, without doing any imputation, is still going to figure out a way to sort of make those predictions. So that, I think, has been one of the goals. I think that's actually, with the latest advancements in AI, we can do those things. And then finally, when we want to make sure we publish our work, or when we sort of really talk about the value and significance of our models, we want to make sure we also validate them systematically. So that has been a sort of really these questions. And these are some of the data sets that we have been using over the past few years or so, and we are collecting more and more data. And most of these are, I would say, research cohorts that are publicly available. Some of them you have to pay for it, like UK Biobank recently started charging us a lot of money. But at the same time, the crown jewel of the data set here is our center one, which is the Framingham Heart Study, where I'm on the executive committee there. So we have access to the Framingham Heart Study, which is a unique cohort primarily because it's a population cohort. It's not like a data set that you would get from Boston Medical Center. So this kind of variability and diversity of data coming in from population cohorts, research cohorts, clinical cohorts is actually allowing us to sort of really capture that diversity and that variability that I think the AI model has to learn as we sort of build these resilient systems. And now I want to spend a little bit of time to talk about what exactly we do on a daily basis, because I think it's important. And I think many people ask me this question, what are you doing? How are you building these systems? And the reality is that we spend a significant amount of time actually doing the groundwork. It's boring, it's tedious, it's painful. We take about 75% of our time to do all this stuff in terms of collecting the data, harmonizing the content. And especially in the context of imaging, we spend a lot of time to think about really those image processing pipelines, which involve registration, normalization, segmentation, selection of interesting regions, do the quality checks as well. So most of our students basically on a daily basis spend this time, which is mainly focused on creating a pipeline that is actually amenable for machine learning approaches. So that, I think, is very important to keep in mind, because unless you have a pipeline that is automated enough to sort of tackle, let's say, 100,000 cases, which we cannot do manually, we cannot actually build some advancements in AI. So this is why we are spending a lot of time to really think about how to automate these things, because I don't think it's possible to do these things manually. And just to give more flavor of what it means, like if you see here on a slide, one of the things we do in the context of, let's say, an MRI is this automated volumetric registration, which means we basically take a source image and then sort of try to align that source image on a target image so that we register every plane, every slice of the image in both the sagittal, axial, and coronal planes. And a typical volumetric MRI would have 100 slices in the coronal side, sagittal 100, and axial 100. So we're talking about even on a single volumetric MRI, so many different slices have to be aligned and registered. So this process has to be done in an automatic sense. Similarly, what we also do is we spend a lot of time to automatically segment or remove the highly bright regions around the brain, like what we call here as skull stripping. And it has to be done in a sense that it is done at every slice. So again, this process has to be automated. And manually, I don't think it's possible. And I don't think even a single image processing technique is actually going to solve this problem. So we have actually come up with our own pipelines where we have used machine learning itself to do this automated skull stripping, where it can identify exactly what the skull is, and then it's going to remove that component as well, right? So all these pipelines took time. And then we started really thinking about, what kind of questions we can ask. And back in 2020, one of my PhD students, Shangran Chu, who is now at Microsoft, came up with a very interesting framework, which took these MRI scans, processed ones, and then came up with a framework to create an interpretable machine learning framework where every region in the brain was processed automatically to identify those specific regions that actually corresponded to specific pathologies such as Alzheimer's. And then he also showed that by combining those imaging data with regular demographic data such as age, gender, and MMSE, you were able to sort of augment the information that the model is trying to learn to actually assess if somebody has the Alzheimer's pathology. And this was published back in Brain, in the journal Brain. And then once the framework was developed, like I said earlier, one of the things we took very seriously was to train the model on, let's say, a cohort X, and then make sure that we see how the model performs on external data sets, like what you're seeing here are 3 external cohorts, which were not used for training, to show that the model is consistently actually making those right predictions in these external cohorts, such as this Australian cohort on the first column, and the Framingham Heart Study on the second column, and the NAC, which is the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center, which is basically a collection of data coming from 37 different Alzheimer's centers in the country. So this is the performance, and there is some consistency that we understood, and obviously there was more work to do, and because of which we then started to ask a separate, so the next question, which is, in addition to the MRIs, which I think, let's say, we can come up with the ways to identify regions of interest within an MRIs to understand Alzheimer's pathology. What if we actually combine more information, like I said, this multimodal information, where you could potentially think about combining demographics, patient history, functional assessments, neuropsychological testing, and MRI scans to ask a slightly more sophisticated question, which was two-tiered question. And the first question was, okay, given all this multimodal information, can the model process all that and then identify if the person has healthy cognition, MCI, or dementia? And if it is actually pointing to dementia, is this dementia due to Alzheimer's disease or due to some other pathology? That was, I think, sort of the second tier question. And for this, we collected data from 8 distinct cohorts, and we used one of the cohorts for training and the remaining for testing. And you see some of these numbers, and I think turned out to be around 10,000 cases or so. And after we trained the model, one of the first things we did was to understand, like I said earlier, this interpretability. What is the model actually trying to identify? What is the model thinking is actually important to make that decision? So on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is this result, which is basically where the model thought, these are some of the factors that I think contribute to making that classification of whether the person has healthy cognition, MCI, or dementia. And it turns out, no surprise, MMSE turned out to be the most important factor. And on the right side, after the model was able to identify signs of dementia, we went further and then we identified whether the dementia was due to Alzheimer's or due to some other non-Alzheimer's pathology. And in this case, MRI turned out to be a hugely important factor to making that distinction. And then to adding more to the understanding of how the model is trying to identify the regions, what I'm showing you here is basically what the model identified as the regions of interest on the MRIs that pointed to specific outputs of interest. And what you're seeing here is just basically this heat map, which shows this color, which is more towards the red region is basically where the model thought was more related to dementia and so on. So again, it was interesting to actually see that the model was able to identify those specific regions in the brain that are known to classically be associated with the condition. Right? That I think was confirmatory as well. And then finally, for about a handful of cases, about 100 or so, what we did was we saw the postmortem evidence because Alzheimer's pathology was evaluated on these postmortem brains, and then we understood which regions actually had that Alzheimer's pathology. And then it turned out that the model predicted regions of interest that pointed to Alzheimer's pathology coincided spatially with those regions where there was postmortem evidence of Alzheimer's pathology. So that is again was reassuring that our model was able to sort of really look at patterns that are classically known to be associated with the disease. And then finally, the icing on the cake was we recruited about 17 neurologists who were basically given 100 cases each. The same cases that the model also was given, where the task was to basically do the same thing, which was, every neurologist reviewed all those 100 cases. And for each case, they basically did two things. One, where they assessed whether the person had healthy cognition, MCI, or dementia. And if dementia, was that dementia due to Alzheimer's or some other non-Alzheimer's? And the same thing for the radiologists, what we did was we gave them only 50 cases. All of them had diagnosis of dementia. And then we asked them the second question only, which was, can you identify if the MRIs are pointing to Alzheimer's pathology or non-Alzheimer's pathology? And, interestingly, the results were favoring that the model was also able to be in line with the experts' assessments. So on the first row, you're seeing basically how the neurologist performed. Each dot is basically pointing to a single neurologist's performance on the question, and the bottom row here is showing the performance of the radiologist. And it turns out after the exercise, a funny comment that I got from the radiologist was that, Vijay, this was a very difficult exercise for us because we don't really do these things on a normal basis. Because what we do is a neurologist calls us and says, look, this person's getting an MRI. I think it's Alzheimer's. What do you think? And typically what they do is they basically go through the MRIs and basically report or create a report that either rule in findings that confirm Alzheimer's or rule out some other indications. So they don't really perform a diagnosis per se. They only perform on a daily basis an evaluation of the MRIs that somehow either confirms or denies what the neurologist actually is thinking, right? So that's something that we only learn. But after that, I think one of the, and this paper was again published in 2022 in Nature Communications, where one of the reviewers challenged us a question. They challenged us with a question. They said, oh, this is great. You're doing something that is valuable, but I don't think it's there yet, primarily because the reality is a lot more complicated. The reality of creating an AI system that can address, let's say, dementias is a lot more complicated than what you actually presented here. Luckily, they didn't reject the paper, but they posed this as a question. And this is something, basically a summary of what I got as a reviewer feedback after the paper was accepted in Nature Communications, was that how are these neurologists evaluating patients today? Right? The patient walks into a clinic with a family member or some other friend, basically with a chief complaint that is related to memory-related issues. And what is the neurologist doing? They gather all this information, obviously standard demographics, history. They actually have a conversation with the patient and the family member. They look at all the medications. They potentially administer certain tests depending on the expertise of the neurologist, because not every neurologist is the same. And then sometimes they order the MRI. It's not always, depending on the resources available. And with all this multimodal data, they have to do these things, which is evaluate the patient's cognitive status, whether it's healthy cognition, MCI, or some other form of MCI. MCI is, again, a very broad spectrum, and whether the patient has dementia, and also dementia could be mild, moderate, severe. So there are a lot of layers to that. And at the same time, the more complex, the more difficult task is to understanding the underlying cause of dementia. And is it Alzheimer's? Is it due to depression? Is it due to vitamin deficiencies? Is it due to some other prior stroke? Or is it usually a combination of multiple different things? So the combination thing is, according to the neurologist, is one of the most frequently occurring conditions, which means a patient typically has comorbid conditions. It could be Alzheimer's pathology and vascular pathology. It could be Alzheimer's and depression. It could be Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. It's always some combinations. So in truly speaking, I think what they gave us, actually a great idea for the next work, was to really think about how to build a system that can potentially address this real world complexity, which is related to how to really think deeply about not just the first tier of assessment, which is NC or healthy cognition, mild cognitive impairment or dementia, but to truly understand the pathologies that are driving the condition. So with that, what we started to pursue was this big study, which almost took like 2 years or so, where we even before we started to work on the models, one of the first questions we asked was, okay, can we collect data across different pathologies that are contributing to dementia? So for which we collected about 50,000 cases across multiple different cohorts, and with the help of the neurologists who identified basically 10 distinct forms of dementia. So one of them is obviously Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, prion disease, which is a rare condition, frontotemporal condition, NPH, which is normal pressure hydrocephalus, and so on. So these are the 10 distinct dementias that they identified, primarily on one single thought process, which was, what is the clinical path that would ensue after this diagnosis? So which means, for example, if somebody who has Parkinsonian symptoms, or if somebody may have Lewy bodies in them, then the movement disorder specialist, along with the neurologist, would actually take care of the patient after the diagnosis. So there is that clinical pathway that is going to be directed after the diagnosis, and based on that, they kind of define these 10 distinct dementias for us. And with this pursuit, what we did was we did this study where we again went through the whole process of creating this multimodal framework where we were able to assess all these distinct forms of dementia, including mixed dementias. And we found that the model was able to capture all these nuances. And then we then again went to the neurologist and asked the same question, which is, okay, what if we give you about 100 cases and then you tell us what are those pathologies that are driving the condition? And here we did something different, unlike previously. Previously, we tried to compare, or we did a head-to-head comparison. Here, what we did was we gave the neurologist those 100 cases, and then we asked them to sort of identify the etiologies driving the condition. But then we also asked the AI model to do the same thing. But what here we did was, instead of comparing AI versus the expert, we compared here the expert versus AI augmented expert. And it turned out that on an average, for all these cases, the AI model that combined with the neurologist actually exceeded the neurologist only evaluations by about 26%, which I think was significant in our opinion, because the first time, truly speaking, we finally made a statement saying that AI could be assistive in the context of at least assessing dementias, because this is where the neurologists actually are getting help from AI, where we showed that increase in performance. I think there is a hand that I think was there. I can stop or I can continue, whatever you want to do.
John, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. This is fantastic. I'm really fascinated by your presentation, so thank you very much. One of the challenges with using real world data is that you have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the extent of diagnostic evaluation, and also by extension, the amount of diagnostic uncertainty. So you're going to have some people who have had PET scans, MRIs, et cetera, and have had many years of information. Then you have other people who are not quite at that point. And so I guess my question is really, what is the goal here? Is your goal better diagnosis with complete information, or is your goal more early diagnosis with incomplete information? Or
it's a great question. I think I wish I can say that I have the answer, but this is what I'm actually exploring right now. And the reason I'm saying that way, because let's imagine again, I'm right now working with, I'm doing a pilot study at a medical center in Arizona. And I'm also working with some folks at BMC. The problems are completely different. The protocols are different. And the questions are also different. The work that I'm doing with the medical center in Arizona, they're interested in clinical trials, whereas in BMC, it's a different question. So what I can tell is that the path to creating any tool that hopefully can become an assistive tool in a setting, in a clinical setting, whether it's a primary care or a tertiary care center, is to truly make it resilient enough to sort of address that heterogeneity, make it flexible enough to take whatever information is available and provide some confidence values about the predictions of that based on that data, so that there is some trustworthiness established here. Like, for example, if I only give demographic, if I give age, I can predict somebody if they have dementia, right? It might be, I don't know, 70% accurate. Who knows? But on the other hand, if I give MRI, if I give PET scans, if I give more, what is actually happening with the model? It's actually getting better at predicting the etiology, predicting actually the condition better, with some confidence values, right? So I think what we're trying to do here is to sort of make it a little bit more practical. And in that process, as we train more, hopefully there is a chance that the model is going to capture that heterogeneity. I don't know yet, but I think we're going to hopefully get there.
Okay, no, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, just in general, the more information you have, the less diagnostic uncertainty you'll have.
Yes.
by definition, right?
Yeah.
I think one additional feature that is, I think in real clinical practice, you also have the advantage of time. So you can evaluate the same person at multiple time points. And that's a little bit different than a question at a single time point.
Yes.
What's your best guess?
Yeah.
And I don't know how you think about
Yeah,
how these tools might be used within that context.
hopefully, yes. I think we have so far only looked at a single time point, but clearly there is a history. We're collecting all the data that has happened until that time point. But as you said, during follow-up visits, as more information becomes available, we can hopefully ask the same question again on the model because it has learned from the prior information, right? So that I think hopefully we'll get there. I don't think we're there yet. But these are absolutely important questions. And I think the challenges that we are facing, practical challenges that we are facing, if I want to sort of bring this to the clinic, right? Because even the neurologists are asking the same question, how can I trust this model? What are the things I have to do to trust this model, right? So we're getting there. But yeah, I think I would say these are probably some baby steps in that direction.
Can I ask a question, PJ, as we're going on? First of all, I just want to say I love the term resilient to mean handles missing data.
Yeah.
It's like a whole, I love but in this specific example, what's the gold standard? Like when you say it's improved, what is it compared against?
So there are two standards. One definitely I can call as gold standard. The other is clinical standard. The gold standard is postmortem evidence.
Okay.
We have about 150 cases or so where, like I showed before even doing this exercise, the first thing we did was on the test data where postmortem evidence was available, we tried to align the model predictions with postmortem evidence. So we saw that there was some evidence of mapping the predictions with the etiology that is driving the disease because of the postmortem information. So that I think is gold standard. But unfortunately, clinical standard is a little bit subjective. And I think depending on who you talk to, whether it's a behavioral neurologist or a general neurologist or a neuropsychiatrist, their decisions are a little bit more variable. So what I'm hoping is that instead of thinking of matching this with the clinical standard, if there is a strategy in the future to really align this with postmortem evidence, then maybe there is a way to standardize or maybe AI could actually help standardize the clinical assessments by being assistive. So that's kind of really the sort of the lesson I've learned. But for these models, what we did was we used these consensus ratings that we got from, right?
So it's like one neurologist versus a neurologist consensus panel.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Again, this is just basically the paper was actually published in Nature Medicine on July 4th. So there was not much of activity going on in this country. So, but we got some press from outside the US. I had an interesting conversation with the guy from Sydney Morning Herald. Apparently, in Australia, dementia is the #1 neurological concern, not stroke. And even migraine, I think, is probably second or third. Apparently, they're more concerned about dementia than other conditions. These are some of the things that I just want to clarify. I think every tool has its own merit. Clearly, there are some bedside cognitive tools. There are some digital health tools that I think people are trying to come up. I think each of it has an advantage. Even biomarkers like the blood-based biomarkers or the CSF biomarkers or even the PET, they also have their own advantages. But it's important to keep in mind that at the end of the day, in my opinion, AI should have a very high bar in terms of making it. But if the high bar is set to make sure that it is actually cost effective, it's accurate, it's very fast, it's also very comprehensive and scalable, then I think we are sort of really getting to that position where we can, build these tools and make sure that these tools are translated. So this kind of really my thinking of how to compare a specific technology with what's existing in terms of the standard. And I guess, yeah, I don't have many more slides. Just these are some of the papers if you're interested. These were published in the last few years. Everything was sort of built on top of the previous one. And now we are working on sort of extending it to sort of bringing some language models into this whole framework, because predicting yes or no or predicting a probability is like one step, but we want to get to the position where we are hopefully also going to be able to summarize the patient's condition. So that's kind of really the next step. These are our collaborators. I think I also have recently some other collaborations going on with Carl Health, which is a new medical school at University of Illinois. It's a rural population, so I'm very interested to sort of access that data. Obviously, Boston Medical Center, and the pilot program is actually happening at the Brain and Spine Center of Arizona. They have 3 different sites, and they see almost 10,000 patients a year. And yeah, summary, basically, I think one of the key things which I want to highlight is that machine learning, about 75% of it is actually to play with the data and make sure the data is actually in good shape. And we love to work with the raw data, which means the pure DICOM files of the MRIs, the pure EEG recordings, pure CT scans, and also in the DICOM format, and all the text and all the unprocessed information that you can get from an electronic health record, that has to be harnessed, not derived measures. Of course, derived measures has its own value, but I think we like to work with that raw data. And actually, the recent advances in AI can actually help us do that. And the true reason why we are able to make this progress is because we are open to collaborating with, especially the clinicians, the researchers who are doing medical researchers. They are the ones teaching us how to do these things. And I'm also very blessed to have students from CS and the medical campus to work together. I think that's exciting for us. Like the North Star for us is to sort of really build a tool that at the end of the day is going to sit next to a neurologist and hopefully be assisted. We're not there yet, but we are sort of basically working on these EHR integrations right now, like at the pilot site in Arizona. And it's actually an interesting challenge. There are a lot of practical aspects of how to sort of get all that information without tampering the information, also making sure that's done in a secure way, making sure all the information is de-identified, and at the same time in the raw sense, so that we can process that. So that actually has been a very interesting computational challenge. With that, I just want to thank my sponsors. These are some of my funding agencies. I got to list this at the end of the day. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was fantastic. It's a really amazing work. Let's see. I have a bunch of questions, but I think people have put in some questions. Oh, so Maria Corrada adds that you might want to add limbic predominant age-related TDP 43 to the list of.
Great point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a data that I can get from that?
Maria, do you want to answer that? Are you still on? Maria.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
I think, sorry, I think I have other.
Yeah, there's a little echo.
NAG has, I think, is starting to collect a lot of information on that.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, I think in our data set we have some, but it's probably not as robust as as what you want. But we can definitely talk. I mean, we also have neuropathology for about 500 people,
Yeah.
so that might be helpful.
Absolutely.
But the main thing I can think of right now is NAC. But we can definitely, I can actually put you in contact with other physicians that actually are working on late specifically. That may be. Oh, Rush. That's true. Rush could also probably
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
We definitely have access to the entire NAC thing. And
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned about TDP-43 because this has been our can I share again my slide deck? Sorry, I just want to show you one figure because you asked me that question. So you see this figure here, FTD with, so one of the, in that Nature Medicine paper, one of the things we did was, like I said, aligning model predictions with neuropathology. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to show all this data, but we were able to sort of show that the probability of the model that predicted the occurrence of FTD, frontotemporal degeneration, was aligned with TDP-43 pathology. This was the only data we had at that time. So we are
Right.
actually doing that. There's some ability for the model to sort of capture perhaps TDP-43 pathology.
Right. Good. Yeah.
It's just a very early stage.
Yeah. 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 But FTD is, I mean, it's definitely that's, I guess, what people in the field are arguing, that is a different entity
Yeah.
that is not
Yeah,
really
that's true.
late, even though both have TDP.
Yeah. Small steps. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Great.
John had asked, how computationally expensive are these processes?
Good question. I spend a lot of money to do computing. I mean, every day, every grant, I have like a line item of purchasing GPUs and all that. So it's expensive. That's what I can say. Fortunately, we have the BU supercomputing cluster. It's okay, but I think you can get started with it. But we do have dedicated GPUs, and if you really want to look at the cost, I think you can go to the BU webpage. But on the top of my head, 4 GPUs of A100s would cost about $50,000, and we use those for training the model.
Renaud?
Hi, I'm really impressed. That was great, and I have a question, but I just want to make a couple of comments. First of all, I want to thank you for mentioning the 75% of the time that you spent on data cleaning and harmonization and QC.
75%.
Oh yeah, yeah, great. All right.
I wish it was
I'll start
35.
counting on my side.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I also wanted to thank you for spending a lot of time on the background and goals. You know, people tend to jump to results and methods, but I think it's very important in your case because I think the fact that you're integrating your work into broader clinical integration, I think is one of the weakest link in a lot of the ML AI research. And I'm not a clinician, but I work in a very clinical setting. I can confirm that the main problem for clinicians to integrate ML tools is really the black box aspect of it. It doesn't matter what kind of like area under the curve or diagnostic property you're going to show, if they can't understand anything about what the process is doing, it's not going to be it's not going to be used. So thanks a lot for this. And my specific question is about, you showed a lot of data with a lot of analysis based on imaging results and MRI analysis. How robust are your methods? How dependent are they on the MRI acquisition being so standardized and being so clean, or can they handle a lot of variability and about the data that is out there in the clinic?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you again for your comments. I appreciate that. So the end goal for us is to have this computer system sit in a clinic, which means any data that's coming in has to work. I mean, think about a neurologist. A neurologist cannot send a patient back home without making a diagnosis because they didn't have an MRI, right? They had to make a diagnosis. That's reality. So if I have to build something like that, it has to be robust enough to address to handle those different variabilities coming from scanner related artifacts or different magnetic field strengths and so on and so forth. And our systems are capable of doing that. For example, right now we can process any scanner, which is Siemens, GE, Philips, 1.5 Tesla, 3 Tesla, whether it's call stripped or not, whether it's registered or not, whether it's T1 weighted or T2 weighted or SWI, DWI, all these things. So the pipeline that we built is robust enough to handle any of those sequences that is normally collected in a typical MRI study. That took like 3 years for us to build, but finally we are there. I mean, and it's open source. We share our codes to the public domain. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to provide more links.
Thank you. Kendra, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. If you can hear me all right. I really appreciate your talk, and I really appreciate you talking about scaling up and cost effectiveness because, it's more my area. So what are your thoughts broadly about the trade-offs of scaling up your model versus, it might have less accuracy when cases aren't as clear cut?
Yeah. Great question. Let me talk about the clinical trials first, and then let me talk about the diagnosis in a moment. So for the clinical trials, what the problem is, we know the numbers. We know that the screen failure rate in the medical center in Arizona was 80% last year. They enrolled with the Eli Lilly trial, GSK trial, and so on and so forth. 80%. So we know what to beat in terms of the benchmark. So even if I get one more case that is going to be screen positive, better than what their standard is, based on the historical data, then they would be inclined to embrace such tools because each patient is probably $100,000 in terms of complete clinical trial costs or more sometimes, right? So there is an incentive for them to sort of look at purely those numbers. But in the context of diagnosis, let's say in a real world clinical setting, it's a little more complicated because, behavioral neurologist, I think there are 3 of them on these co-authors of these papers. All 3 of them told me on my face that I don't need your tool because I can do my things, which is great, right? But then I clarified that it's not the tool for them. It's actually a tool for somebody who actually needs it. So what we're doing is we're trying to create that high standard where even if our tool matches the behavioral neurologist, then perhaps there might be some trustworthiness that can be built so that upstream in the cycle, like somebody I think talked about early diagnosis before, right? So typically, no, I don't think it's typical to expect a patient to directly get an appointment with a behavioral neurologist, right? First, they go to a PCP or maybe a general neurologist or family medicine doctor, so on and so forth, and then maybe they'll end up at the behavioral neurology setting, and by that time it might be already too late, right? So hopefully, if we build these tools that are standardized in such a way that it meets that very high standard, maybe there is a chance for us to push them upstream to where there might be some need, right? So, but I don't know if there is a number at this point because it's too early.